Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I really couldn't be more excited by the hour that we're about to spend together. My name is Josh Rovner. I'm the Director of Youth Justice at the Sentencing Project, a research and advocacy think tank in Washington, D.C. We're a leader in changing the way Americans think about crime and punishment, but we don't do that work alone. Today's discussion is important and timely. You're going to hear from some of the smartest people that I know, the partners in our work, and they're each facing their own challenges in reforming our deeply flawed youth justice system. It's really a hopeful story. I think you all know that we're joined by our friend Liz Ryan, the administrator of the Federal Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, OJJDP. In Liz, we not only have an experienced expert in youth justice reform, but someone who cares deeply about all of our kids. You know, I regularly talk to people, advocates, legislators, public defenders, reporters, who repeat the same story about a fear of crime, specifically youth crime, influencing the prospects for reform. It's tough out there. Really, it's always tough, but things feel different right now. So we're going to start with the facts. Is youth crime getting worse? And if not, where on earth do those fears come from? We're going to be joined by my colleague at the Sentencing Project, our senior research fellow, Dick Mendel, who will share some research on youth crime trends and what works when kids do get into trouble. We're then going to have a roundtable with Alycia Castillo. She's the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Texas Center for Justice and Equality. Andre Sims is the lead youth organizer for the Youth Art and Self-Empowerment Project in Philadelphia. And Krystal Williams is Director of Government Relations for the Office of the Maryland Public Defender. The thing that we wonder about is that, are we facing a return to the 1990s when fears about a generation of so-called super predators sent more of our kids to adult courts, jails, prisons, and caused spikes in incarceration in the youth justice system as well? Can we learn from those mistakes? And as you'll hear, they were definitely mistakes. We've left time for your questions, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded. We will share it along with some of the resources that we're going to discuss today. But before that, I'm pleased to bring on my friend Liz Ryan, the administrator of OJJDP. And let me tell you about Liz. She joined OJJDP as administrator on May 16th, appointed by President Joseph R. Biden. She brings more than 30 years of professional experience in legislative and justice-related issues, including more than 2 decades spent as an advocate for juvenile justice reform. Before joining OJJDP, Administrator Ryan served as founding president and CEO of the Youth First Initiative, a national campaign to end the incarceration of youth by investing in community-based alternatives. Since 2014, the initiative has achieved the closure of youth prisons in 6 states and redirected more than $50 million to community-based alternatives to incarceration. Administrator Ryan founded the Campaign for Youth Justice in 2005 and served as its president and CEO until 2014. A national multi-state initiative, the campaign sought to end the prosecution of youth in adult criminal courts and their placement in adult jails and prisons. During her tenure, it contributed to legislative and policy changes in more than 30 states, a 60% decrease in the number of youth in adult courts, and a greater than 50% decrease in the number of youth placed in adult jails and prisons. Administrator Ryan co-founded and co-chaired Act for Juvenile Justice, a campaign to reauthorize the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. She served as advocacy director for the Youth Law Initiative, a national field director for OJJDP's Juvenile Court Centennial Initiative, and as an advocate for the Children's Defense Fund. She's written extensively about juvenile justice reform, including articles, editorials, reports, and chapters of books. You can see why we're so excited that she's here now. Liz has a bachelor's degree from Dickinson College and a master's degree in international studies from George Washington University, which is also where I went to grad school. So we have that in common too. So with that, I think I'm going to ask Dick and Alycia, Krystal, and Andre, if you could turn off your cameras, and I'll do the same. And Liz, I'm going to load up your slides so that you can present that. Here we go. Share.
Thank you, Josh. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to join you on today's webinar on youth crime and juvenile justice reform. For over 3 decades, the Sentencing Project has worked to end the nation's over-reliance on incarceration and promote systemic criminal and juvenile justice reform. The Sentencing Project is tireless in its pursuit of racial, ethnic, and economic and gender justice. So I'm pleased to be joining you all today. I want to thank the Sentencing Project staff for their commitment to this challenging but necessary work. And I also thank them for convening such a timely conversation and inviting me to be part of it. Prior to my appointment as the OJJDP administrator, as Josh said, I was a juvenile justice reform advocate for nearly 25 years. And I've been fortunate enough to work with so many dedicated visionaries in the field whose singular goal is to transform the juvenile justice system into a more developmentally appropriate, rehabilitative, and just system. Together, our field, the juvenile justice field, has collectively achieved substantially reducing the use of incarceration. We've collectively achieved changes in state laws in many states so that many fewer young people are prosecuted in adult criminal court or held in adult jails and prisons. And we've worked together to successfully reauthorize the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act and strengthening its core protections for children. But as you know, much more work needs to be done. I know firsthand how critical federal support is to the success of this work, and I pledge as OJJDP administrator to continue our collaboration and partnership. Next slide, please. OJJDP provides national leadership and resources, including training, technical assistance, supporting research, and funding to states, territories, tribes, and communities so that they can better protect children, prevent delinquency, and improve their juvenile justice systems. Next slide. There are 3 priorities that guide our work, and those are treating children as children, and this includes keeping kids out of adult jails, adult courts, and adult prisons, and taking a much more developmentally appropriate approach. We know also that we should be serving children at home with their families and in their communities and shifting away from incarceration. And our 3rd priority is really opening up opportunities for young people who've had contact with the juvenile justice system so that they have the same chance at success as any other young person. And at the heart of these priorities is an unwavering commitment to racial equity and fairness, and a promise to partner with impacted youth and families to really listen to young people and family members and act on what they tell us what works and what doesn't work. OJJDP unreservedly supports juvenile justice reform because it's the right thing to do. We've all seen the shocking headlines, though, reports of long isolations of young people, use of force tactics, lawsuits filed by hundreds of former residents alleging abuse in multiple states, and in some instances, death of children in custody. These, unfortunately, are only a few examples of the harms that our young people experience in detention and prisons. Data, research, and experience prove that it's possible to hold young people accountable for their missteps and give them a second chance at better outcomes. To do that, we have to reduce the use of detention and incarceration and implement much more effective community-based alternatives on a much more extensive basis if we want to support the well-being of our young people, their families, and communities. Highly publicized incidents of violence, including mass shootings, community gun violence, and carjackings, have contributed to the public's perception that there's an uptick in youth crime. In response, some communities are seeking to reverse long-standing bipartisan juvenile justice reforms. A few states are considering lowering the age of criminal responsibility and implementing harsher punishments for young people, such as placing young people who are under the custody of the juvenile justice system in adult prisons, for example. OJJDP is aware of and concerned about reports that some communities may be experiencing an increase in some crimes among a few young people. But the latest available data, national data, tell us a different story about violent offenses committed by young people under the age of 18. In fact, violent offenses by youth under age 18 have dramatically declined between 1995 and 2020, according to data that OJJDP released earlier this week. You can move to the next slide now. Thank you. So here's a chart. So overall, arrests of young people went down. Law enforcement agencies made an estimated 424,300 arrests of youth in 2020, which is a 38% drop from the previous year and half the number from 5 years earlier. Fewer than 1 in 10 of those arrests were for a violent offense. Next slide. The proportion of arrests involving youth for violent offenses has declined over the last decade for each offense category, dropping by half from 2010, when youth accounted for 14% of all violent crime arrests. And we'll hear from Dick Mendel shortly about the Sentencing Project's review of youth violence during the pandemic and their conclusions based on available data that youth violence has been flat or declining for years. During this webinar, we're going to delve into data, examine why misinformation about trends in youth crimes persist, and discuss ways to combat that. Children deserve a second chance, a chance to grow up free from violence, a chance to stay out of the juvenile justice system, and a chance to turn their lives around following involvement with the juvenile justice system. I hope that information shared today will dispel some of the misconceptions about youth crime and steer policymakers and practitioners away from implementing measures that would harm the very communities and young people that they're seeking to protect. And you can turn it to the last slide. And here are ways that you can connect with OJJDP following this webinar. Back to you, Josh.
Apparently I was muted. So Dick, I just wanted to turn to you and see if you're ready to present as well. And
I'm sure I'm ready.
I apologize for the technical difficulties on my part. And let me load up your slides and start your presentation. There you go.
Okay, great. Thanks, Josh. And thanks to all of you for attending today and for your concern over the troubling narrative that's taken hold in the media about young people in crime. We've all seen the headlines, an epidemic of news stories advancing the narrative that youth crime, including serious violence, has exploded during the pandemic and poses a grave threat to public safety. We've seen lengthy stories about youth carjackings on national media outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, and Fox News. We've seen countless more stories, a tidal wave really, of breathless coverage in local newspapers, and especially on local TV news, presenting youth crime as a present danger to all of our safety. Often the stories have lacked any data to support this narrative, or they provided data that's skewed or cherry-picked, lacking balance and historical context. Time and again, reporters have unquestioningly parroted the talking points of law enforcement leaders or other public officials with a vested interest in promoting the youth crime spike narrative. This frenzy of media coverage has consequences. It makes it more difficult for youth justice reformers to win support for long overdue changes needed to align the youth justice system with their emerging understanding of adolescent development and what we know works to combat delinquency and to promote youth success. That's why we at the Sentencing Project decided to take a deep dive into the data. I'm going to spend my few minutes with you here today describing what we learned. The top line finding is that from the information available, there's no evidence that the US has experienced a youth-led crime wave since the pandemic began. In fact, most of the evidence, as Liz said, suggests that youth violence has been flat or declining. More specifically, we found that from the year 2000 to 2019, the share of total US crime committed by youth fell by more than half. You can see it here, from 15% to 7%. From the new data that Liz just mentioned, we know that this trend continued into 2020. In fact, youth under 18 accounted for just 6% of total arrests nationwide in 2020, and the youth share of arrests continued to decline in every single crime category, directly contradicting the narrative of a youth-led crime wave that's been saturating our media. We know that since 1994, the youth arrest rate for serious violent offenses has plummeted by 79%, far more than for any other age cohort. Please note that the arrests for serious violent crimes have fallen for all the age groups you see here, but has fallen most and fastest for young people. Again, we found that in 2020, the first year of the pandemic and the last year for which national data are available, that young people's share of crime continued to decline in every major crime category. We found that compared with 2019, the year immediately preceding the pandemic, the total number of serious violent offenses by youth actually declined in 2020. Even when it comes to carjacking and to homicide, the two crime categories generating the most attention, evidence of a rise in youth offending is limited. With carjacking, it's true that there have been reported spikes in a number of cities, and that youth have been a disproportionate share of carjacking arrests in many of those jurisdictions. It is critical to realize first that police only make arrests in a small share of carjacking cases, just 10 or 15%. Therefore, we shouldn't jump to any conclusions if a big percentage of these few arrests are youth. Second, the US doesn't track data about carjackings on a national level. We don't know whether carjackings went up or down nationwide in 2020. But we do know that robberies by youth, of which carjackings are a subcategory, actually declined in 2020. With homicides, there's little evidence that youth played a leading part in the sizable increase that our nation saw in 2020. While the National Incident-Based Reporting System found that the number of youth homicides did increase in 2020, the share of homicides committed by youth continued to decline to the point where youth under 18 were just 7.5% of homicide arrests in 2020. That's only about 1 in 13. Of course, all these data take us only through 2020. There remains a chance that youth crime did increase in 2021, or that it's increasing this year. But even if that turns out to be true, it would not be a reason to scale back recent reforms in youth justice or to promote punitive policies against youth. Why not? First, because a temporary rise in adolescent lawbreaking during the pandemic would not be surprising given the trauma and disruption that young people have experienced. Last December, the US Surgeon General proclaimed a national crisis in adolescent mental health. That problem cannot be solved with harsher punishments in the court system. Second, because there's now overwhelming evidence that harsher punishments in the justice system, or in most cases, any involvement at all in the justice system for youth, is counterproductive. Transfer to adult court, heavy reliance on detention and confinement, the criminalization of routine adolescent misbehavior in school or anywhere all tend to heighten delinquency, worsen youth outcomes, and undermine public safety. So what does work to combat youth violence? As we noted in our report, the evidence points to two priorities. We need carefully measured, evidence-informed interventions for youth who commit delinquent acts, and we need to make targeted investments in young people's healthy development and in the well-being of their families, schools, and communities. More specifically, the evidence shows that it is far more effective to hire counselors rather than police officers in our nation's schools, and to address misbehavior at school through restorative justice or emergency mental health interventions rather than suspensions or arrests. It's far more effective to divert young people accused of all but the most serious offenses into restorative justice and other community-led diversion programs, rather than adjudicating their cases in juvenile court. It's far more effective to keep young people at home and in school following arrest in the vast majority of cases, rather than placing them in locked detention cells. It's far more effective to provide positive youth development opportunities and evidence-based interventions in the community for youth who are adjudicated delinquent, including most youth who have committed serious offenses, rather than placing them into correctional institutions. And for those youth who must be prosecuted, it is far more effective to process all cases in juvenile courts, rather than charging and punishing some youth as if they were adults. They're not. Though much work remains, justice systems across the country have made steady, though uneven, progress towards most of these goals over the past 2 decades. We cannot allow a wave of misleading and often sensationalized reporting about youth violence to distract us from decades of experience and research on what actually helps kids and communities thrive. Thank you. And with that, I'll pass it all back to Josh. Thanks again.
Thanks so much, Dick. I really appreciate those slides and the research that you did that informed this. So Andre, Alycia, and Krystal, could I ask you to come back on screen? Thank you so much. So from here, I'm going to ask some questions of the 3 of you. Could I just ask you to each introduce yourselves, starting with Andre? Andre, I think you're muted right now. Actually, Krystal and Alycia, I can see you are too. So, Andre, if you could unmute yourself, and while you do, Krystal, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Krystal Williams. I'm with the Office of the Public Defender in Maryland. I currently serve as the Director of Government Relations, but I previously have worked throughout the divisions in our office, mostly working with juveniles. I started in 2001 in our juvenile division. I'm sorry, 2011 in our juvenile division. And then I also recently worked in our youth defendant unit, where it is a special division that is dedicated to making sure that youth who are charged as adults, that they have the opportunity to have their case transferred back down to juvenile court. So my background with the Public Defender's Office is primarily with serving and representing juveniles and youth in our system.
Thanks. Andre, and then Alycia.
Peace, everybody. My name is Andre Sims. I'm known to the community as Artist Day 1, Not Day 2. I'm also the lead youth organizer for the Youth Art and Self-Empowerment Project and the lead organizer for the Care Not Control campaign, also founder of nonprofit organization Day 1, Not Day 2. What we do at YAS, the Youth Art and Self-Empowerment Project, is participatory defense. We also help young people with court support. We're also involved in a restorative justice program called Healing Futures. And so at every level, we're working to support young people who've been impacted. And what's special and kind of unique about our organization, we're led by young people who've been directly impacted by these systems. So.
Thanks, y'all, for having me. My name is Alycia Castillo. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Texas Center for Justice and Equity. And we're an organization that works on ending mass incarceration through the lens of social and racial justice. I also serve on the board of Equity Action, a local group here in Austin, Texas, working on justice transformation in Austin. I'm happy to be here today.
Thanks so much. So let me ask sort of a follow-up question about how your individual experiences inform your advocacy and inform your work. And Andre, would you like to go first?
Sure, thank you, Josh. My experience is a little different. I was actually incarcerated at the age of 17 and served 8 years in an adult facility. And so while I was on the inside, I had trouble adjusting, as do many young people who find themselves in, adult state facilities. But throughout that time, I educated myself. I worked with organizations, community partners. I've worked with the Licensed Public Safety Initiative, Villanova, the Prison Literacy Project. These are the programs that weren't court ordered, that weren't, mandated by the state. These were community partners that came in to, help the men, help us, and empower that leadership. And so I started organizing while I was in jail, while I was incarcerated, and started trying to be a part of the solution instead of part of the problem. Let's fast forward a little bit. I came home like a little over a year ago, been working with the Youth Art and Self-Empowerment Project and the Care Not Control campaign, advocating to end youth incarceration and using my story to, give a platform to other young people who don't have that opportunity. And it's been especially effective, and I feel those value all young people's voices, especially young people who've been directly impacted, are valued, because we often don't get a chance at the table. We often are excluded from these conversations, and it's hard to find solutions for people that we're not talking to, that we're not inviting in. So yeah, that is my experience.
Thanks. And someone just put in the chat box, carenotcontrol.com. That's the organization that he mentioned for Pennsylvania reforms. Krystal, why don't you go next?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Josh. First, I just want to say my background, comes from following organizations like the Sentencing Project, who have continuously put out amazing data and statistics and just information that has helped inform the public, helped informed students when I was, in college and undergrad. This was incredibly helpful information to kind of help inform me in terms of what the landscape was across the country in terms of racial disparities and the impact of mass incarceration. So, and I've also followed the work of Liz Ryan, who has been phenomenal with the work that she's done prior to her current position. So I just encourage folks to really look to those organizations and look to the data that's out there to be informed. But in terms of my personal background and the work that I do as a public defender, I come from a perspective that, I really truly do identify with a lot of the clients that I represent, whether that's coming from a background of individuals who struggle financially within their families, who have had parents who have been incarcerated, who have had family members killed through gun violence. These are all things that, nobody should have to experience, but a majority of the people who are impacted by the criminal justice system, unfortunately, deal with very serious issues that very few people have a personal perspective and understanding and willingness to have that compassion and understanding on how we need to overcome life's hurdles in order for individuals to have the opportunities to thrive. I will also say that, as an individual who has grown up in a predominantly white community, I have seen the disparities of how Black males, I do have a twin brother, I often, share the story that I see a very distinct way in terms of how my brother has been treated by society in terms of opportunities that have been presented to him versus myself. And so, I feel a duty to make sure that young Black men are given that same voice, given that same opportunity, and also given that same encouragement and belief that their lives can change, that there are better opportunities out there for them, but they just need to be exposed to them, and they need people who believe in them and can help push them forward. And so, I do think it's very important that these experiences play a role in how I advocate and how I continue to represent individuals who need a voice.
Thanks. Alycia.
Well, first, prior to my work in policy and advocacy, I was a teacher, and I was working primarily with students with learning disabilities. So I saw firsthand the way the school to prison nexus really affects youth, and how those kids who are first excluded and underserved and penalized really in our education system can end up in our criminal punishment system later on down the line. But also, I'm the granddaughter of immigrants. I'm a first generation college graduate. I'm a crime survivor, and more recently a mom to two twin 2-month-old boys. And so all of the host of my experience, like Krystal, I can also identify with a lot of the folks that we represent here in Texas.
I'm so thankful to have each of you tell your stories, and that matters a great deal. We started this out with data, but the facts we find only get us so far. And people all have their individual stories to share, and it's part of what makes effective advocacy. A question that I want to ask the three of you, though, we know that this work is always hard, and I'm just kind of curious how you're finding in an election year, or at the start of this year, at a moment that it does seem, from media reports and no shortage of anecdotes, that people are sort of freaking out about youth crime in spite of the facts that we saw. So what is the atmosphere like in your states? And Alycia, I'll start with you in Texas.
Sure. So you're right. It is always hard, but I will say that it's been devastatingly challenging in recent days. There seems that in the past, there was always at least an open door to a conversation about improving the experiences and outcomes of kids who are caught up in the punishment system. But during a particularly divisive election year, I'm finding that those who probably would have defaulted to a sympathetic position on our issues are either now trying to out tough on crime their opponents, or really staying silent on matters just because they're afraid of how they'll be perceived. So certainly challenging and a little demoralizing.
Andre, would you like to talk about Pennsylvania? I know you've been in the state capitol quite a lot.
Yeah, I would like to talk about Pennsylvania, and just starting with Philadelphia. We have a progressive DA here, and what we've seen with this explosion of this fear-mongering in the news and the media, he's even backpedaled on a lot of, the promises that he's made to get elected. And we're seeing people be reactive, whether it's the news, whether it's the media, whether it's the legislators being reactive in their language. And it seems like we're regressing back to the state of being tough on crime. So I'm really concerned right now with the conversations and the rhetoric that we're hearing, because it's having an effect and it's creeping its way into courtrooms. I've been in situations where we're doing court support for a young person, and a judge is deciding to hold a young person on charges strictly because of what's going on around, what's going on the news. They're referencing it. We see on the news every day. We see all the time on the news and read articles. This should not be it, because it's not the case. The news aren't reporting facts. They're not reporting data. They're not getting the real stories. They're only getting part of the stories. And we're seeing this really change this climate right now, and it's extremely concerning.
Krystal?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think quite simply, we have to start having those really difficult conversations about race and understanding how race and implicit bias plays into media, just how media coverage is portrayed, but also how we're receiving that information and responding to it. This is a really good platform for individuals to really kind of do the research, to really understand the statistics that are behind all the fear mongering. It simply is not there. We are in a time where we need to move away from all of the history of policies that have done so much damage to communities, so much damage to young Black men. And I would say, plain and simple, we have to change the way we view and see young Black men in our country. We have to stop criminalizing them and dehumanizing them. And we really have to take active steps and making sure that our elected officials are taking those active steps and really making the change and standing against the tide. So I do think that our elected officials have that capacity, but we also have to stand with them to give that assurance and that confidence that the data is there, the research is there, the information is there for them to make the right decision. And we have to stop with the tough on crime notion. It simply does not work. It has not worked, and we need to do things differently.
Yeah, one of the parts of this that I find so interesting, and it's a part of this conversation that actually kind of bugs me, is that I'm really not convinced that voters are expressing a fear of crime at the ballot box in the way that the media and politicians seem to be responding in the way that the three of you talked about. There's been a couple of elections that were certainly bad for progressive prosecutors, but one of those was a very low turnout recall election in San Francisco with so few people voting. And New York City elected a tough on crime mayor who is now so unpopular he might as well pitch for the Red Sox. Like, they hate that guy now. I also see polls, that show a lot of people consider crime to be a very serious issue. Well, people always consider crime to be a very serious issue. The context is how you would compare this to 5 years ago, to 3 years ago. And I think that the data suggests, the polling data that is, show that people always consider crime to be a serious issue, and people always think crime is getting worse. So we find ourselves in this atmosphere where I think that our challenge is elected officials and the media to a much greater extent than the public. And I think that we should feel some confidence as we do this work. I'll ask one more question and then bring Liz back on. We really haven't had a chance to talk about the reforms that each of you are working on. Let me go in the reverse order. So we'll go Krystal, Andre, and Alycia to talk about the bills that you're hoping to see passed or recently saw passed in your state.
Yeah, so we've made some incredible progress in Maryland. That being said, Maryland has traditionally been ranked as one of the worst states in the country in terms of how it treats children in the criminal justice system. So, we have a very low bar to overcome in terms of, the things that we need to accomplish. That being said, last year, I feel like we made technically this year, we made some significant changes in the law in terms of the juvenile justice system. One of them being changing the age in which juveniles are actually being charged and prosecuted in juvenile court. Previously, there was no age barrier. I've represented kids as young as 7 years old, which is it's shocking to your conscience to have to represent a 7-year-old who doesn't even understand what a judge is, what an attorney is. His feet don't even hit the ground from sitting in the chair. So, we have to really have this paradigm shift of what these laws are doing to our communities and to our children when we're prosecuting them and criminalizing them from such a young age. So that is a huge change that we have done in Maryland, and I hope other states follow. One of the other things that the Juvenile Justice Reform Bill does is it makes sure that individuals who have low-level offenses, that they're not being incarcerated for those particular offenses, technical violations, and also making sure that there are additional opportunities for diversion and really expanding those opportunities for the court to utilize them. One of the other really significant bills that we were able to pass was the Child Interrogation Protection Act. That bill in particular is a really powerful bill because it makes sure that children are allowed to have the consultation of an attorney prior to being interrogated by the police. And we know that so many police officers use deceptive and very intimidating interrogation tactics, since they don't really ensure that children really understand what their Miranda rights are and what the implications are in terms of speaking with police. And so this bill just makes sure that those children have that consultation and the understanding of what their rights are with an attorney prior to that interrogation taking place, and that their parents are also notified if that interrogation is going to be taking place. So these are very significant bills that we passed, but we, like I said, have a long ways to go. One of the next things that we're going to be working on is making sure that children are not charged automatically in the adult system. Right now in Maryland, there are over 33 offenses that automatically place a child in the adult system to be prosecuted, to be held in an adult system. And there are just some horrific things that happen to children when they're prosecuted as adults. I have firsthand experienced that in representing these individuals. And so I really hope that we continue to move forward and eliminate that, that practice. So.
Yeah, Krystal brought up something interesting about kids charges if they're adults in Maryland. And Maryland uses it about as aggressively as any other states. By count, it's second only to Florida. And by rate, it's second only to Alabama. And I think that what that gets across to me is that people think of Maryland, which is where I live, as being a blue state. But there's no shortage of challenges wherever you live, things that can be reformed for the better. Andre, Pennsylvania's kind of purpley, so tell me about what you're working on there.
So it's interesting right now where we're at. Just to give a little bit of a background, as a result of a lot of the scandals that were exposed in the juvenile justice field and these facilities that were holding juveniles, a task force was formed to investigate and come up with recommendations for how we should reform the juvenile justice system. And that task force which was from about a year or so ago, came up with 35 recommendations. And there could have been more recommendations, but we were, pretty happy with the recommendations that came out. Unfortunately, the bills that we saw as a result of these recommendations passed are, a very surface level approach. They don't do enough to, really solve this issue of what's going on in Pennsylvania right now. One of the bills that we are happy about that's been introduced, has not yet passed, but has been introduced, is a bill to end direct file, which Krystal alluded to, is the practice of charging you automatically as adults for a certain level of offenses. And right now we have a bill introduced, and we have an opportunity to stop this practice in Pennsylvania. And we're still dragging our feet with that. And there's a lot of pushback by the DA's office and pushback by the judges out here. And I think it's important that we honor the experiences of young people who are victims to these facilities. I'm on the regular speaking out against, the facilities, for example, Lima in Delaware County that was shut down. They're already about to rebuild it before their investigation is over. And so I'm really excited about this bill. I've worked personally with Senator Bartolotta. She's done an amazing job of, hearing youth voices and hearing young people's perspectives and experiences, because these stories are important and they're being lost. And so direct file SB 1240 is one that we're very excited about. Also, eliminating fines and fees in the juvenile justice system, that's SB 1233. That's a bill that we're very excited about as well. So there has been progress made, but we have a lot more work to do, is what I will end with.
Thanks. Alycia.
Yeah, so like Andre mentioned, I think anywhere that we see youth prisons, we see scandal, just hand in hand, because caging a child is just sort of antithetical towards the goal of rehabilitation. And so while we are working on things like raise the age and things like allowing for earlier parole eligibility for people who were sentenced to extreme sentences in their youth, ultimately we're working on facility closure. We know that where there has been really significant success in decriminalizing children and in decarceration, it's been predicated by a commitment to actually close the youth prisons. And so personally, I believe no child should be in a cage. And until we get to that point, continually working on policies that promote the decriminalization of children, that expand access to the resources that children and their families need to thrive. Those are the things that we'll be promoting here in Texas.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to ask Liz to come back to join the last 20 minutes or so that we have. Thank you, Liz. And remind everyone that you can send your questions in the Q&A. I see that the chat has been very busy today, which I appreciate, but questions for the panel should go into the Q&A, and we'll do the best that we can to get to those questions as we can. Many of you have asked will it be recorded. It will be, and we'll be sharing it via email in about a week or so, along with some of the resources we talked about today. But for Liz, we went over your bio, the organizations that you led, founded for that matter. Your office is now producing the data that we all rely on and inform today's presentations and work that we do at the state level. So the way that I see it, you've gone from being an outsider to being an insider. And I'm curious of how your experience from before prepared you for making change from the inside.
That's a great question, Josh, but look, let me just share some takeaways from this conversation and from looking at the data, that these trends in youth crime over the last 25 years between 1995 and 2020, the last year for which we have the national data, these trends are very encouraging, right? So the field's efforts to prevent and address delinquent behavior have made a measurable impact. So as we hear about anecdotal, perceived, or even real spikes in youth crime, that doesn't justify rolling back all of the field's advances in juvenile justice reform. And why is that? That's because progressive juvenile justice policies have a predictably detrimental effect on young people and their families and communities in the long term. And we also know that they exacerbate racial and ethnic disparities. So here at OJJDP, what I've brought to OJJDP are the field's priorities, that we need to treat children as children, that we need to serve children at home with their families and communities, and that we need to open up opportunities for young people involved in the justice system. And the research backs us up in this. So just some takeaways for me in this conversation are that to help counter the narrative of a youth-led crime wave, it's important that we look at the data. We put these incidents in context, and that we highlight all of the programs and policies that have kept young people out of the juvenile justice system. And that's where we should be investing our time and our resources.
Thanks. So I'm really hoping that we have convinced our audience that we have the facts on our side, that youth offending continues to decline. There's no youth-led crime wave. So I'm curious to hear from all of you about the limits of data and facts and advocacy, that is to say, and what other tools are at our disposal. What works when you're meeting with the legislator to make the change that you're looking for? Alycia, would you like to go first?
Sure. So first in a conversation, especially as folks who strive to be person first centered, it's important for us to validate those fears. Everyone wants to feel safe in their communities and in their homes. And the issue here is that we've equated safety with something that produces more crime, right? By caging people. And so in order to kind of shift the narrative on what really is public safety, we have to start asking that question to folks. What does make you feel safe? And oftentimes we won't find that it's more police on the street corner, or more cages in their neighborhoods, right? It ends up being things like access to healthcare. It ends up being things like ensuring that my loved one who is experiencing a mental health crisis has somewhere that they can go and restabilize. So those are the types of things. Housing just came in the chat. Absolutely, so many things that are just basic needs that human beings have that are currently not being addressed, while we continue to spend and pour billions of dollars into our criminal punishment systems. And so it's important as we're talking, just to hear, to start to talk past the typical things that we know have already failed us in terms of producing more public safety, and begin to listen to what folks are really asking for.
It's true. Andre.
I think there's a lack of knowledge of what data actually exists out there. And I think it's extremely hard to, get current data as fast as we need it, because life is happening right now. And it takes some time to do research and to collect that. And so that's a challenge that we have. But I've also seen stories work very well when it comes to connecting with legislators, when it comes to connecting with lawmakers. Because you could go to school and learn how to crunch numbers and learn how to do surveys and to study, but you can't go to school to know what it feels like to be in solitary confinement for a prolonged period of time in an adult facility solely because you're a young person. You don't get that type of knowledge from just studying or going to college. And so I think it's important that, legislators take the time out to sit down and involve everyone who's been directly impacted in that process. I've seen firsthand, lawmakers ask me intricate questions that sometimes I feel uncomfortable answering, but I do because, it's important that we get this out there. I feel like, from the perspective of people who've been through these type of experiences, it's hard to talk about, but it's so important to talk about because what goes unspoken, it doesn't add to this full picture. And so I've sat down and had conversations about how I've struggled while incarcerated as a youth with rehabilitation. And I really had a hard time adjusting because when you're in an adult facility and you're focused on survival, you have no time to focus on rehabilitation. You have no time to focus on, growing because you're not in a safe space. You're focused on surviving and living to the next day. And especially as a young person, I saw somebody in the chat put that, adult facilities are extremely intimidating to adults. So imagine what a youth is going through. And I think what we're seeing in the news and the media is we're seeing our emotional response and we're reacting to our emotions. And I think it's important to combat that with what emotions are created when you listen to what we're putting young people through, the type of trauma, the type of suffering that we're subjecting them to, by doing this, by this tough on crime rhetoric, by these laws that aren't taking this into account. And lastly, what I found is that a lot of the lawmakers don't really know the impact of these laws that are going into place. They don't know how that's going to affect a young person and their family. Like, I think there's a preconception, there's this myth that it is helpful, but statistics show opposite. So I wanted to add that and just stress that it's important that we tell our stories, and anybody that has a story, especially a young person, like you could reach out to Care Not Control or the Youth Art and Self-Empowerment Project and, have your voice heard.
Krystal?
Yeah, and I thank you, Andre. I really appreciate you talking about that in terms of just making sure people understand the harsh realities of what happens when we have these really horrific policies in place in terms of what it means for children and youth, their families and their communities. So many times when I have, spoken with legislators or spoken with people of the community, but also individuals that I've represented and their families, folks don't understand some of the really unspoken truths about what happens to kids and youth in the criminal justice system. Everything from a child, we don't think about it, but a child is actually being strip searched by adult correctional facility members when they're charged as an adult. So you have children who may have prior trauma in their lives. Maybe they've experienced sexual abuse, maybe they experienced physical abuse at the hands of an adult, and they're placed in these facilities where they are, like Andre said, they're in a state of trying to survive, but they're also being re-traumatized, and they're being exposed to an environment that is just creating a mindset where they have to defend themselves and putting up that armor. So we really have to think about what we're doing to the children when we are criminalizing them, when we are incarcerating them, when we are prosecuting them. I recently had traveled to Tanzania, and there's a Swahili saying that they use to greet some each other, and that is, Kansarian Ngare, and that means how are the children? That is their greeting. And so we have to really understand what we're doing in asking ourselves every day, asking each other, how are the children? Whether you have children or not, that is something that we always need to be asking ourselves. And when we really look at the data, when we look at the truths, the stories, the anecdotes, of what's really happening in our communities, what's really happening in these jail systems, what's really happening behind those walls, most people, if not all people, would be truly horrified and want to do something and would want to act. And so I just encourage you to really reach out and talk to folks like Andre who have been through it, who have experienced it, and to folks who are actively involved in activities that are trying to help change these policies and these ways that are taking place throughout our country. I would also say that, get involved with your local legislatures, testify, be that voice of your community to help explain what's going on. If you are an individual who has been impacted by the system, if you are somebody who has a loved one who's been impacted, share those stories, because people want to hear them. They matter, they're important, and that's what needs to be exposed, is what we often don't talk about, and that is the actual impact and the damage that's being done to our communities.
Liz, do you have any response to these ideas that you just heard?
I mean, I just want to echo some of what Krystal just said, and that is really listening to what our young people are saying about the justice system. And I want to thank Andre so much for your sharing your expertise and your experience with everyone today. That is what we all should be doing. Our justice system needs to listen more to what young people recommend we do to help them grow and thrive. And, we've held listening sessions all summer with young people, with family members and other stakeholders in the justice system. And that's the bottom line, right? If we're going to really do the right thing here, we need to start by listening to what young people say works, because they are closest to the issue and they know what the solutions are. And so that's what we're doing here at OJJDP, looking at what young people say will work and investing in that.
Thanks so much. We're coming up toward the end of the hour, and I'm going to get to the question, sort of blending together things that people were sending us. And I'd be curious to hear how people think we can respond to media bias, effective ways to do that. I know that I'm pretty active on Twitter and writing back to reporters that I don't like, and letters to the editor are a way. I'm curious what tactics other people on our panel have used to respond to media bias and call it out when we see it. Alycia, why don't you start?
Sure. So TCJE actually has a report on media bias that has occurred in Texas and in Houston more specifically. And we've done a deep analysis to find that it's a big problem. And we realize that if it bleeds, it leads, and that there is an incentive for media companies to promote what gets the most clicks. But we also find that the media can be an extremely effective tool when it comes to accurate portrayals of what's going on in the justice system. And TJJD, Texas Juvenile Justice Department, is currently under investigation by the DOJ and is experiencing a number of our children there are experiencing absolute crisis right now. And we found some recent reports came out from the Texas Tribune that really highlighted kind of the devastating details of what's going on inside those walls. And that is something that really brought the public together to care about the issue as well. So if we can speak with our media representatives and let them know that we want to hear the truth and we want to hear what's really going on in our communities, I think we'll find that that's what the public really does want to see.
Andre, Krystal, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would add that, like, what we do here with Care Not Control and Yes is we try to build relationships with reporters, because a lot of the times the bias comes from, like you said, not talking to the other side and only getting one perspective. So we try to balance a proactive and reactive approach. Where on the one hand, we're reaching out to reporters, trying to build those relationships and, let them know that young people causing havoc in the city is not like the story, the over prevalent story that's happening. Like I work with a lot of young people who are doing amazing things in the community. And so building those relationships and giving those stories platforms are very important. And then also, like, we've directly combated some of the rhetoric that we're hearing through op-eds. I have an op-ed out right now about direct file. And a lot of our youth organizers, put op-eds out and use their experience to kind of give platform to what's going on. And so balancing that, and then also just taking every opportunity that we can to uplift young voices on a platform, because again, I would stress is the story of we're all causing havoc out here is just not the case. Like I run a program where we are paying local artists to make socially responsible music, and we don't want to talk about that, but you would rather report, you know, a shooting or something negative in the neighborhood. And somebody said in the chat, if it bleeds, it leads, and we're seeing that. And we as a community need to push back on that, and you know, really also instruct people on how to, you know, interact with the media and how to really be, you know, critical about what we're taking in, you know. So that's what I would add. Krystal?
Yeah, no, I think these are all excellent points. And I would just add to that, you know, that we have to challenge ourselves in the information that we're receiving and making sure that we're understanding motives or incentives behind the information that's being given to us and how it's being given to us. And so we have to be consciously aware of how information is being provided through the news, and be reminded, you know, that there is a huge financial incentive for incarceration, for prisons, for certain policies to be in place. And so we have to constantly question what are the motives behind, you know, continuing rhetoric that we know does not work. We have to educate ourselves, look to multiple resources. Don't just rely on one opinionated version of what's in the media. Go and do the research, go and educate yourself, go and ask yourself the questions to make sure that you understand the true scope and picture of what's being provided in the media. And, you know, one of the things that I think over the past couple of years, you know, we've just been inundated with so many different types of media and different perspectives, but I think it's up to us as individuals to make sure that we're educating ourselves and really taking the extra steps to broaden our scope of media retention, but also the information behind the media, making sure we understand where it's coming from and how it's being given to us.
And Liz, I'd just like to ask you sort of about elements of an effective conversation with the media. What is it that you find helpful?
A couple things, Josh. I mean, I wanted to point out some of the resources that OJJDP has. You know, we have a website. We've got the report that we released this week, and you can get it online at ojjdp.ojp.gov. So we have reports like this that we did with our colleagues at the National Institute of Justice, a lot of data that's collected through the National Center for Juvenile Justice. They're both tremendous resources for the field. And I find that giving this kind of information to reporters can be very, very helpful. We also have information about effective programs. We have a model programs guide, and we put out a regular email called JuveJust. So sign up for that and get those regular updates. But we also have one other source I think that's helpful for reporters is to hear from young people, right? Some of the sources for media, we need to broaden the information that they're getting. And when I think that the public actually trusts young people more than anyone else in terms of what's happening with the justice system based on available polling. And so that's really important to widen the sources of information, having young people share their perspectives with media. And sometimes that's more than just a phone call after a reporter's done the story. It means going and sitting down with that reporter and talking with them, or it means actually going and talking at schools of journalism so that students who are doing more and more of these stories can actually learn more about what's going on with the system itself. But I just want to make sure that you all know that we're a resource here for the field, that we want to provide information that's helpful for reporters and for other stakeholders, and that you'll contact us if we can be helpful to you in that regard.
Thanks so much. You know, we're up on our hour here. I just want to say how grateful I am to this huge audience that we had. I'm sorry that it's just impossible to get to all of these questions. You know, one of the things that you can do is get involved in your own communities. If you get in contact with us at the Sentencing Project, I'll be happy to refer you to people in different states. We also have some research coming out just next week about alternatives to formal system involvement. It's a report about diversion from juvenile courts that we're really going to be very proud of. People are always looking for solutions and alternatives, and we like to provide that as well. That's going to be next week's report. This conversation is one that should be ongoing, and I hope that you'll have it in your communities as well, and I hope that you'll be in touch with us. The Sentencing Project, you can Google as well as I can, but we're at sentencingproject.org, and the other organizations that are here are also easily accessible. We also all welcome your donations to do this work. Not so much true for the government agencies, but in the nonprofit sector, we certainly need your help and your support in all of the ways that you can offer it. So thank you all. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to our audience. I appreciate it.